Tristan, there's something really wrong with the story that was published in The Atlantic on Thursday night, alleging that President Trump made some disparaging remarks about fallen soldiers while he was overseas. Now, this story was published on Thursday night, and by Friday morning, there was already an ad that had been cut by a group called Vote Vets. It was rolling on Morning Joe, being promoted on Morning Joe. Tell us a little bit about what we know is going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to start, Vote Vets never got back to me on whether they had colluded with The Atlantic or the people who The Atlantic spoke to for the story last night.
Two possibilities, right? That either they colluded with The Atlantic or they colluded with the people who tipped The Atlantic off.
And it's pretty apparent based on the timeline of events here that they colluded with someone. Someone let them know that this story was coming. Mm-hmm. So this in Vote Vets is this progressive group that's supporting Joe Biden in every way but name only. On Morning Joe, they came out with an ad that was a direct response to this piece in The Atlantic last night.
And when did The Atlantic piece run? I think it was in the evening, right?
Yeah, it was Thursday night. So it was last night the Atlantic piece was published.
It wasn't yesterday afternoon. It was in the evening.
Right. I mean, it's late in the day. It was after close of business. And so there's really, looking at this ad and how well produced it was, mm-hmm. how well put together it was, there's no way that these people just drew up this ad overnight and had it ready to air on Morning Joe, which is an early morning program on MSNBC. And it's characteristic that they would put it on Morning Joe because it's a liberal program. It
had like 5 different parents of fallen soldiers providing their perspective, just filmed with their smartphones clearly, but still those all had to be coordinated and then edited together with some of the B-roll footage they had and then sent to Morning Joe in time to get it to roll. It does seem highly unlikely.
Yeah, and even more so, they had to find these people, and they were probably people within the organization already, they had to find these people and have them all record these videos.
Yeah, and then they had to edit the videos. And the other thing about the videos is that they're not just generic anti-Trump videos. They're actually using quotes from the article.
Exactly.
So no matter what, the article had to hit, then they had to coordinate these phone recordings from all of these different fallen soldiers. Then they had to edit them all together. They had to add the B-roll footage. They had to get it off to Morning Joe. It seems unlikely that and by the way, in order for them to have been tipped off, it would have had to have been a specific tip with the quotes. Because again, they got all of these people right away with the exact quotes from the Atlantic piece.
I mean, without question, this was a direct response to an article that came out just hours ago. And this was not an ad that they could have produced overnight. I mean,
I don't think it is.
It would blow my mind if they did.
If they had just used B-roll footage and put some of the quotes over it, and some of it was really simple. They cut some like screenshots together. If it had just been that, I could maybe say that it had happened that way. But when you bring all of the other people into it, it seems really hard to do that overnight.
Yeah, because there's a lot of moving parts in that ad that had to be coordinated and put together.
Right.
It's not something you can just do from home on a computer and knock out in a few hours. You have a ton of people involved in the creation of this thing and packaged and ready to go for Morning Joe.
Yeah, and so tell us more about what is in the content of the article.
Yeah, so The Atlantic published this piece last night alleging that Trump made more disparaging remarks about fallen soldiers. And what it says is that Trump called these World War I soldiers buried in a cemetery in France, quote, losers, which is why Trump actually last minute canceled a visit to the cemetery on a 2018 visit to France. Now, the entire story from The Atlantic, written by the magazine's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, is based entirely on anonymous sources. We don't know anything about these sources. We don't know what the role of these sources was in the White House, if they even worked in the White House. The article itself could have been made up. The quotes could have been made up. Mm-hmm. And we know that there's a lot of people in the Trump White House who left not on good terms, who have an axe to the grind with the president.
Well, especially in the foreign policy circles. And so this article is sourced to 4 anonymous people vaguely. We don't know anything about them. We know that they're 4 anonymous sources. And that's the extent of our knowledge. Now,
so typical in American journalism today too, right?
It's especially when it comes to the Trump White House. And you make a really good point that there are a lot of people in the foreign policy circles that have come through the Trump administration and do have access to grind and were never particularly fond of the president to begin with. And when they leave office, they then make that very clear and sell books or chat with journalists on deep background and can't be, can't put their names to any of this. But for four nameless people to go on the record accusing the president of this, I think is interesting. We've talked about the timing, but I also think it's interesting because we know what Donald Trump said about the Khan family. We know what he said about John McCain in the past, and the article has, some new stuff about John McCain, some new alleged comments that he made about John McCain. I don't understand what the point is.
Exactly, and this is like a routine exercise in our media today.
Yeah.
Some outlet, a big outlet, publishes an entire piece that's damning the president that's based entirely on anonymous sources.
Yeah.
But this routine exercise, especially the one that came out last night in the last 24 hours, it feeds into the narratives of both sides here. It feeds into the narrative of Democrats and legacy media who think Trump is morally corrupt.
Yeah.
But also feeds into the narrative of people like us in conservative media and just conservatives in general, calling out the media for flouting journalistic ethics.
Yeah.
And so you really have the last 24 hours giving in ammunition to both sides here.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me because if you publish this with somebody on the record, I would be very interested in that, right? Like if this is, I don't know who, if this is somebody coming out and saying, I served in the Trump administration, I was in this meeting and he said this, this, and this, okay, that's interesting. It means that he's continuing to say things that maybe he's said in different terms in the past. Okay, I'm interested in it. But to publish something like this with four anonymous sources where you're giving absolutely no clues to who their identity is at all,
Right.
Not even like former White House official, really nothing, I think is completely ridiculous because this is when I was like, oh my gosh, it didn't pass a really basic fact check. And,
Right.
Twitter is a terrible place, but sometimes it's really useful because it didn't pass the basic Twitter fact check.
Yeah, and to speak to that, we have four people who are going who are anonymous here. But we also have one person today who actually did go on record about the events
at the meeting that this allegedly took place during,
and did go on record about the events in the article last night. And it's someone who has an axe to the grind against the president.
His best friend.
John Bolton. Who literally published a book this year that was the last breath for Democrats' impeachment hopes in February. So this is, the fired former national security advisor is not someone who wants to give Trump a lot of credit for a lot of things anymore. But he went on record today saying he never heard any of the remarks that were quoted in the Atlantic piece.
He said it's certainly possible, but he was at that meeting and he didn't hear it.
Absolutely.
And
his book contradicts what the article says.
Yes, this is important. His book contradicts it.
Exactly.
In print.
His book talks about the events in France during the 2018 visit, and talks about how the White House did decide to cancel his last minute visit to a World War I cemetery because of the weather. And the article says that Trump used the weather as an excuse because he didn't want to visit the graves of losers, is basically the gist of what they claim Donald Trump did. Meanwhile, we have John Bolton months earlier, whenever he wrote this book, just casually mentioned that it was canceled because of the weather. This is not like a detail that he would have any reason to lie about at the time that he wrote his book. So it's just this could have been fact-checked so easily. And the weather was a real issue. A lot of people when that first came out rolled their eyes and said, oh, the president's not going to go visit graves because of some rain. Well, the weather was a real issue because in John Bolton's book, he explains how the Secret Service was describing how the president's helicopter couldn't fly in that low visibility. It was okay visibility for combat, but not safe enough for the president. They also talked about how they decided, possibly they could drive to the cemetery, but Secret Service said that wasn't okay either because it was going to be a 90-minute drive one way, and they were not easy roads to go on, where if something happened, they could get the president out of France quickly. And so the weather was a real issue, given the circumstances and the location of the cemetery.
But this is what's so weird to me, is that if somebody knew what they were talking about, four people, this isn't one anonymous source, it's not even two anonymous sources, it's not even three anonymous sources, it's four. If they were at a meeting when this was allegedly said, then they should know exactly what was happening in terms of the weather and have no reason to lie about it, unless it was to make Donald Trump look like he needed an excuse to get out of this and to to basically a predicate for their story that he was disrespecting fallen soldiers. But at the same time, it's a remarkably stupid thing to lie about because it's easily Googleable. So I have no idea what the heck is going on here.
I mean, the Atlantic, what we saw in the last 24 hours is not uncharacteristic of the Atlantic under Goldberg's leadership. We've seen multiple times in the last year, Atlantic writers have literally just made up stories. Our senior editor, Chris Bedford, did a lot of reporting on this earlier this summer, where that magazine literally just out of nowhere made up a police shooting.
One of the writers.
Right, yeah, one of the writers just made up a police shooting to advance their narrative to defund police.
Right.
And after our editor called them out on it, they didn't release a response for 4 days until they were finally pushed to finally make a statement and clarify what happened. And so this is not uncharacteristic of the media, of the Atlantic today.
Well, the media, more broadly, it's certainly
both
not.
are true.
And, you know, it's sad because this is a really inflammatory accusation against the President of the United States, and I think an objective observer should be concerned. I mean, I guess it depends on what how you're voting, right? Like, if some people are voting, they say, like, we know Donald Trump is morally corrupt, but we like his policies, we think they're going to protect the lives of unborn babies, we think they're going to, whatever your cost-benefit analysis is, that's one thing. But I think, you know, anybody should be concerned if their president has this hostility and disrespect for members of the military. But to publish it with 4 anonymous sources in a way that doesn't pass a very basic fact check, it's exactly the kind of thing that's going to get blown up and further erode trust in the media, which is already not in a good place. We're in the middle of a pandemic and a recession and racial unrest, with so many people in this country having declining trust in our institutions. And these mistakes really do have consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. It sows distrust in our media, and it sows distrust in institutions overall, because you have the people who are going to believe these stories, and they're not going to have any trust in the president and the commander-in-chief, the White House, and government officials. And then you also have people supporting the president who aren't going to trust the media.
Right.
And they're not going to trust these DC Beltway insiders who are just sowing gossip that might be relevant to inside the Beltway, but it really just disservices the people outside in the country.
Right. Tristan, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.